think we are here today to talk about how progress might be made on many issues, improved democracy, greater strides towards racial justice, and greater strides towards economic justice. And we thought rather than, you notice I gave very brief introductions, because we thought that maybe a good way to get started would be for each of you just to talk a little bit about the work that you're doing now and how that work connects to the overall theme, and then we can go from there. Does that sound like an okay way to start?
It certainly does. We didn't talk about order. I'd like to start, and then John will go and Catherine will define order. Perfect. I feel like I've been talking a lot for 3 days, so I'm going to try and keep this relatively brief. But now, with the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, as part of the Democratic Practice Program and the Racial Justice Initiative, is to have a very distinct honor to be able to support organizations and people doing work across our democracy by leading from behind and leading from listening. Those were skills that we were not taught terribly well here, right? That, rightly so, right? We're standing up, we're being affirmative, we're making arguments, we're engaging in space. But the notion of what it means to work in connected community, to understand the ecosystems where people operate, to understand how organizers connect with advocacy, connect with movement lawyers, and understand the weighty responsibility of being in rooms that sometimes can determine what work is even undertaken and what work isn't. Who has the opportunity to move into the world and who doesn't? And recognizing that with that, it must come with listening. And a lot of what we're hearing now is the importance of the need and demand for change. But to listen how it comes from community and communities who are most impacted by the challenges and difficulties in our democracy today. We have a lot of really well-thinking, well-guided, well-meaning people who do a lot of thinking and a lot of writing, and I wouldn't count myself among them, but are not deeply ensconced in the lived experience of people's lives. And I would say the deepest and most important part of my work, given what we've been tasked to do, given that I'm frequently in community, in space, with folks making deep decisions, is listening and elevating the voices that are most impacted and bringing that forward. It is not about being the smartest person in the room. It is about being the best listener and how you translate the clear and express needs and ideas and notions forward. We do not, there's a lot of terms that we use in this space. We have to empower communities. We're giving this forward. Communities, I'll give an example. One of the things we hear a lot is that communities are vulnerable. We have to worry about vulnerable communities. Communities are not vulnerable. That is infantilizing. Vulnerable, children are vulnerable. There's a different kind of vulnerability there. Communities are collectives of intelligent people who know what they need to survive if you're prepared to listen. It is not that people have no voice, it is frequently that people aren't willing to listen. If you take the notion of vulnerability and you try to form solutions around vulnerable people, you form a certain set of solutions, right? How do you help people? How do you make things better for them? It starts to form around an idea of charity rather than strategy. But if you frame a community and say, a community is targeted for over-policing, targeted for underfunding, targeted for undereducation, the solutions change immediately. A vulnerable person looks very different than a person who's targeted. And I would argue that any community that is targeted as many of our communities of color are targeted, you'd see many of the same outcomes. So the notion of the sort of inherent vulnerability or idea is just flawed. It's turned out, we have to turn these things on its head, looking at how these systems and processes actually target constituencies, spaces, communities, geographies for failure. And understand then that the solutions we seek to provide, they look very different if we acknowledge the actual processes and purpose of the communities and the systems, that are brought to bear. And so I think the two most important things about my job: listening, elevating the community in these voices, and clearly understanding the structures and systems that impact communities, and working just as hard on the positive interventions and the vision of the future as we do on simply pushing back the bad.
So I'll talk about my current endeavor and then some of my past work and how it contributes to creating this 21st century democracy. So as Professor Paul mentioned, I'm running for Plymouth County District Attorney, and it's no walk in the park. When one of our other alum, Rachel Rollins, ran for Suffolk County District Attorney back in 2018, the landscape was very different. One, because Suffolk County has a significant amount of people of color here, and it's a very progressive county. And the ACLU, where I work, was running a public education campaign called What a Difference a DA Makes. It was really raising the level of awareness that people had about the role, power, and influence of district attorney. And despite the fact that people thought that these outdated notions of, kind of splitting the minority vote or splitting the progressive vote, and there was another candidate in the race that seemed to be the heir apparent because they came from the office and had the endorsement of the outgoing district attorney that he would win, and that the three candidates of color and the one white progressive candidates would all kind of cannibalize each other's votes. And that, in fact, is the opposite of what happened. Rachel won with a significant lead in a five-way contested primary. And so where I'm running, the county is 86% white, 40% of the county voted for Trump, and the overwhelming number of voters are unenrolled, and Democrats only lead by a margin as far as registered voters. But part of what my campaign is about, and I promise I won't turn this into a stump speech, is really building out a political infrastructure so that other people of color and progressive candidates can run and win, which is something that has not traditionally happened in Plymouth County, given the demographics and the politics of the community. Brockton, where I live, which is a part of the county, has a significant population of people of color. It's the blackest by percentage city in Massachusetts. It has the highest percentage of Black homeowners, and also has a disproportionate representation of people in the system being prosecuted by the Plymouth County DA's office. And so the demographics of that community that has a large immigrant population of Haitian and Cape Verdean and folks from the Latinx community that have not been politically engaged, because people look at the voter rolls and say, well, these folks don't vote regularly, so I'm not going to invest my time and resources in trying to engage them and get them to turn out to vote. And progressive candidates in other parts of the county have tried to push for progressive ideas, but the candidates that have been before them have been so centrist that they kind of lose hope. And so running on a progressive platform, building out an infrastructure that engages more people, trains up people that haven't had an opportunity to be involved in politics or campaigns before. The hope is that those folks will either be inspired to run for office themselves, or then go work on somebody else's campaign who's running a progressive campaign and platform. And so I think that's one of the ways that we continue to shift the conversation about what's possible and what our politics looks like in this country. When I was at the ACLU, there were several things that we did to really modernize our democracy. I think the pandemic created a perfect opportunity for us to reevaluate how we engage civically. We saw a significant increase in the number of town and city committee meetings and hearings that were happening on Zoom. The number of people who participated in these community governance events was much more significant than what it had been in the past. And it suggested that we could get better engagement and outcomes if more people were involved and there were greater access. And so the ACLU was pushing for a digital democracy bill that would increase the number or level of access that people had through making Zoom meetings available or other type of online platforms for people to participate in local community meetings, whether it's the city hall or the town or school committee or the zoning board, making sure that more folks are able to engage. We also were advocating for the passage of the Votes Act here in Massachusetts, which would have made permanent some of the voting provisions that happened in the midst of the pandemic, making permanent mail-in voting in the drop boxes, and use that also as an opportunity to improve voting, tweaking our automatic voter registration process so that it happens on the front end as opposed to the back end, which has been proven to increase the number of people who register to vote. Ensuring that people who are incarcerated, who are eligible to vote, which is people who are not serving sentences because of a felony, but are serving misdemeanors or are held on bail, they are still eligible to vote, but historically have not been able to get access to ballots or making sure that they have their registration information available. Or if they did send in an absentee ballot, clerks would reject it because it came from the local correctional institution. Ensuring that those people who are behind bars, who are citizens still and eligible to be registered and participate in the democracy, have an opportunity to do that. We also tried to get in same-day registration because that's been shown to have a significant impact on increasing participation of voters, particularly in communities of color. And it's not that there's like tons of new people registering to vote. Majority of the folks who benefit from same-day registration are people whose registration has lapsed, and that's an easy way to fix it and get back up on the rolls. That piece didn't make it into the bill that finally got passed, so folks are still fighting for that. But that was something that happened too. And then in another role, and I'll stop here, is I serve on the board of the trustees of the Hines Foundation, which is a racial justice philanthropy. And one of the things that we're really trying to do is support and invest in grassroots community engagement investing. And so it goes to Keesha's point around not empowering the communities because communities have power, but investing in the power movement of communities and identifying grassroots organizations that are building wealth and building power for their community, because that translates into political power. When an organization is able to mobilize masses of people to advocate and engage with their lawmakers and legislators, they're more likely, lawmakers and legislators are more likely to be responsive to the demands of the community. But if they feel like this segment of my district is filled with people who don't regularly engage, I'm not answerable to them. I'm going to be answerable to the people who I know are regularly going to vote or give to my campaign. Whereas if these grassroots organizations have mobilized around a particular issue, those lawmakers are going to be much more responsive to the concerns and demands of those groups, because they see how they're able to get people to show up and put pressure on a particular issue or lawmaker. And in addition to the mobilization efforts, it's also building wealth, because a lot of the advocacy that happens just cannot depend on philanthropy alone. And so mission-related investments is another significant aspect of kind of making a more robust populace that's able to engage and hold accountable lawmakers.
Hi, Northeastern. I haven't been back. Is this mic on? I don't think it is.
Okay. We'll share.
Is it on?
No.
You can hear me. Well, I'll just keep talking.
I know it's not 6 feet. But
I haven't been here in a long time, and it's really nice to see all of you and to be in community with each of you. And I'm going to keep this short, my introduction, so we can get into the meat of what we want to talk about. My job now, I'm a managing partner at a public affairs firm called Civitas, and I run our office in New York. The role that I play there is I do big picture, long arc thinking. Like what is the world we want to create, and how do we create future possibilities, and what do we need to get there? And part of the way that I work on that is I do come out of government. I worked for a former governor of New York named Andrew Cuomo, whose name is no longer in my bio. At one point, it is where I learned a lot of skills about power. And as part of that, I spent a lot of time deconstructing what did I learn and what is useful from that, what should I keep, what is no longer serves me, to go to some of the points that you made. But one of the things I have kept is, how do we build power to build and create new progressive possibilities? And the reason I think about that so much is because we have the majority in this country of people, like-minded people, who are trying to make this country a better place. And we, because of systems and that we'll get into and impediments along the way, we don't use that power at the capacity that we can. And a lot of space where I spend time is around gender, because women are the majority of the electorate in this country, and we're about to lose the right to an abortion, right? That is a right that we've depended on for 50 years. And where are we? We could build a multiracial constituency of women and change the face of this country for the rest of our lives, right? And there are lots of reasons why that doesn't happen, and I can talk to you all day long about patriarchy, so catch me after the talk. But it's a real thing of how we think about how we mobilize differently to create new possibilities. The other piece of that is I'm an institutions person. You know, I went to law school like all of you. I worked in government, and I believe deeply in policy. And so one of the things that I do is work with future policymakers. I teach a Black Policy Institute with Alicia Garza that is teaching Black community leaders how to use policy to get closer to liberation, because we think that it is a pathway to building power. I work and teach a graduate class on policy formation around gender and sexuality, where we really talk about how do you make policy that dismantles white supremacy and patriarchy so that we can start to create something different and new. Because the thing that I feel is that our institutions right now are set up to work against us, but institutions are made of people, and we can get involved and actually change those. And that is how I spend my time. And I spend my time thinking about dreaming. Like, I don't know how much we get to dream, right? About what the world could look like, what the world could be. And when we get into some of the questions today, I want to frame that so that we can start taking the skills and knowledge that you all have and turn it into future possibilities.
That's great. Thank you all very much. So Keesha, I want to pick up on one of the things that you said, which I thought was extremely powerful and interesting. And that was the difference between looking at a problem affecting people who we perceive as vulnerable versus people who are targeted. I recently read an article actually in the Psychology Journal about how once you fix on one solution, even if you think you're open to more, it's very difficult to look at the additional one. So if you start with the wrong one, you're really in trouble. So you want to start with a different one, which is that. I want you to tell us a little bit more about how solutions look different from the perspective of if you see someone who's targeted, what sort of direction does that take you? And just so I can be consistent and not doing with a very good question, consistent with that, I think one of the themes of the day is the intersection between economic inequality, racial injustice, and democratic disaster. And so to the extent that you're talking about solutions, if we think those three things are all connected, how can we move in a way to bring on all three of them simultaneously with this new lens that we really do? Which I thought was great.
Sure. And I think there was an important phrase in the question, people we perceive as vulnerable, right? That is not a definitional condition, right? That is an other imposed label, and really taking and shifting those ideas and notions and what we do with that. The word I want to pick up on to respond to your question is power. What is it? How do we understand it to operate? How do we leverage it? At the RBF, through our democratic practice work, which is organized around two notions. First, democratic practice. That's the intersection of democratic systems and democratic culture. We do not strictly look at how the systems function and operate, nor do we simply look at how many people show up to the polls. We don't just do voter registration. All of these things are important, but we look very carefully at the intersection of the two. How do our systems come together and engage around our democratic culture to actually improve the condition of our practice of democracy? And to do that, we've identified three primary strategies. One is voting rights and elections. The second is money and politics, which will soon become something different called the economy of democracy. The distinction between the two is that let me finish and then I'll come back to that if we have time. And the third is movement building for structural change. The power analysis there is, for us, is rather clear. One, elections and voting rights are about standing. What are the informal and formal rules and systems that allow individuals and collectives to actually exercise power through our democratic systems, and do people have standing for power? And ensuring that enough people can show up, enough people can register, enough people can engage, that we look at our redistricting processes, the quality of our census, and look at all of these things together to say, how do we make sure people have standing? The economy of democracy work is really about how we look at challenging power in concentrated political and economic elite spaces, right? This is about challenging power, right? This is about looking at some of the systems that actually break our affirmative democratic cycle. Voters elect politicians, politicians pass policy, politicians act on voters, voters then re-elect, and there's an accountability process unless the policy that they're engaging around is actually designed by corporations and not people, right? Unless you register all the voters that are looking and thinking about progressive ideas in a space, and they're all packed into two districts. So then so voters of color packed into a smaller number of districts, such that when you have a 120 person legislature, they're actually represented by 4, 5, 6 legislators. What does it actually mean when we have these structural challenges and to really interrupt that? So when we talk about the economy of democracy, we're really talking about what is the infrastructure for distribution of resources within that microsystem of democracy. And when we limit that notion to money, we're excluding the coin of the realm oftentimes, which is influence. Money, qua money, is just money. Money, as it turns into influence, becomes something. But if that's the only way you define influence, how do we then focus on solutions that are based in people? How do we focus on solutions that are based differently? And so we're changing our focus from the way it's been structured for 20 some odd years in the program to something different. And then movement building for structural change is where we support the actual people contending for power. Looking at some of the systems that Catherine was speaking to, looking at how Rasan was speaking to, like moving people, mobilize people, animating people, and funding work that's actually defined within that space. And so those are the three levers, but we think about these in terms of standing, contesting, and challenging power, and how they have to fit together. I'm going to stop here because I could launch into a whole nother thing, which I'm not going to do. I do want to pick up on one thing which I thought was really interesting when Catherine mentioned the subject of her class. she teaches over at NYU, I teach at the SIPA program at Columbia. In my class is democracy, movements, and public policy. How do movements translate through our democratic processes to actually create public policy? How far or close from the policies that were created by the movements do they actually get to the goals? And then what is the distance as we think and create and ideate, and we ideate with our students to think what's next? How do we take those lessons and create the possibilities for the future? So not surprisingly.
Sounds like we need to coach you.
So it feels like we have some really interesting overlap, but I will leave that there.
Oh, me, okay, sure. It's interesting, right? When I watched what happened unfold on January 6th, I saw this sea of white folks storming the Capitol, and this overwhelming sense of grievance that had been building and festering, culminating in that one moment, and animated by this notion that something had been taken away from them, that we were moving away from the country that they believed America to be in their heart of hearts. And what challenged that was more people of color coming into positions of power, more women coming into positions of power and influence, the representation in corporate sectors looking more like what America actually looked like, as opposed to what corporations have traditionally put forward. And it's interesting to see how that undercurrent has always been there. And there have been times where it was more blatant and more direct than others. But I was always taken aback by folks who just said, like, this is such a low point for our country. We've never seen anything like this. And it reminds me of the Saturday Night Live skit with Dave Chappelle and Chris Rock, where they were watching the Trump election results, and the white people were just like, this is the worst thing our country has ever done. And Chris Rock and Dave Chappelle are looking at each other like, oh, really? Do you remember slavery? Do you remember Jim Crow? And so there are these facts, these truths that go unspoken, that are tied to the heart of democracy. When you talked about racial injustice and economic injustice and how they're intertwined, and we saw it during the pandemic. The communities that were hit hardest by COVID were the communities that usually had the highest concentration of people of color, but also had the highest concentration of people living in poverty or close to poverty. And that's just not by happenstance. That is an outgrowth of this nation's history and identity being rooted in white supremacy, and this uninterrupted thread that I say runs from slavery all the way up through mass incarceration. And there are inflection points all along the way. And so the notion of democracy rests on these ideals that go unexamined. And so the rebuke to the 1619 Project was so visceral, because there was this idea that America was this perfect nation. And when people begin to kind of pull the threads away, it becomes uncomfortable. And so to the question of, like, how do we move beyond? How do we fix? How do we change? I don't know that. But what I feel is eminently important is, one, there has to be a level of truth-telling about who this nation is, who we have been as a nation, what we have done as a nation, and support that not just with anecdotes, but with data and analysis. And not that data and analysis and empirical evidence is going to solve everything, because I've seen it play out in the legislature where we've advocated for different types of reform and put empirical data and analysis before lawmakers, but they were unmoved to bring about progressive reforms. But I think the more that the conversations are happening, whether it's in academic research that gets presented before judges, right? We were one of the advocacy strategies that we were looking at in challenging what a colleague of mine, Matt Siegel, likes to call the architecture of policing, right? All of the Supreme Court jurisprudence that governs what police can and can't do that lead to some of the very violent outcomes that we see, whether it's pretextual stops, consent searches, or officer having a fear for their safety. If in every case that there was a pretextual stop, there were statistics and data that was put before the judiciary that talked about the disparate rates of racial profiling and the number of searches that happen to motorists of color and the more hostile interactions that they have with police, but the lower frequency with which contraband is recovered from their vehicle. If in every pleading there was a, for lack of a better term, a Black Lives Matter motion that was filed, it begins to have the impact of changing the judiciary's perspective. If that information then is put before the legislature, if that information is the same information that the community is talking about and advocating, there's a hope that there's a shift that begins to occur. Again, I don't believe that it will change it overnight, but we've got to put the stakes in the ground in the places where we are and continue to do the truth telling, no matter how uncomfortable it becomes. And I think we are beginning, for as much as there is a significant backlash, there's this pendulum that swings back and forth, right? We get Reconstruction, we get the post-Reconstruction era, right? It's just like, oh, there's Black people in the legislature in South Carolina, and then, oh, there's the Ku Klux Klan, and they criminalize Black folks, right? And you say, oh, there's a Civil Rights Movement, and the Voting Rights Act of 65, and the Fair Housing Act 68, and then it's like, oh, and then there's the war on drugs. Oh, there's Barack Obama, and now there's Donald Trump. So there's always going to be that pendulum that swings back and forth. But every time it swings back, the progress is a little bit further. And so the more truth-telling that we are engaged in, and the more empirical data that supports the positions and reforms for change, I think the better chance we stand of really shifting where we are as a society and democracy.
Yeah, I'm gonna stick with the truth-telling for a bit, because I think that, and I'm glad you brought up the pendulum shifts. I think that one of the issues is that extractive capitalism, of which this country is built, depends on individualism. And this idea of American individualism and American exceptionalism, which I would argue is killing us, and makes us feel like we're exceptional in doing so. And because of this fixation on individualism, we don't know how to talk about the collective. And we don't create policy system structures that actually benefit the common good. And this is by design. I would say that the two major points of collectivism that have happened in our country, one was Reconstruction, and the other is around the 1970s, when we were seeing real reform happen in the women's rights movement, but also around consumer affairs, right? There was a real calling on government to take care of people. And Reconstruction, calling government to reflect the people who lived in this country. Both of those things, then to the point that you made, were erased. And in the 1970s, what happened is we actually were at a tipping point in this country to be quite different as a kind of a collective good where government works on behalf of the whole, and that we were building something that would benefit the majority of the country. And this is when neoconservative thought started to really bubble up and say that this is ruining the fabric of this country, right? That this idea of the common good was actually linked to socialism. These are the same words that we hear now, right? And would take away American freedom and American individualism that would cause all hell to break loose. And as a result of that, we have bought into a structure where when people fail, it's their fault, right? That we don't like rise and fall as a collective. We blame the individual. And then we don't have systems in place to actually work on behalf of something bigger or better, because we're always pointing to those individual victories. And from an advocacy perspective, it's how we can win, right? It's by identity politics and trying to get things done that benefit, the groups and constituencies that we're working with. But I argue that the reason that we don't get ahead when you say, like, how do we solve this problem, is because we don't have a greater commitment to this country to the common good, because it's been erased. And the reason it was erased, right, is to preserve capitalism and the status quo, so that the people who had power could keep that power. And I can talk about memos and things that were written at the time that really laid out this call to action to say to government, to corporations, you need to get in the game and be politicized, because we're losing by the social good, and we have to undo that. And before that, there were not corporations in how policy was made and how people were elected. There's nothing like Citizens United. It wouldn't have even been on the radar. But this was a call to action, a call to arms in the 70s that has perpetrated until now and completely erased this idea that we could be a collective body that is working on behalf of the many. And until we get to that point, it's going to be very hard for us to build a 21st century democracy, because we're not holding government responsible to bigger picture ideals of what needs to happen to take care of the whole. And so we can get more into this, but I feel like, just building on what you said, some of the pieces that we need to shift from a power perspective and just from a learning perspective is, how do we build something that erases the individualism, calls on our government to actually take care of the whole? Because listen, politicians don't have the power to do it. We actually have to create an infrastructure where something like the Voting Rights Act fails, and it's a failure of government that we challenge as people, as opposed to, well, this politician has more power than that politician, right? But right now we have no expectation of that. And until that starts to shift, then we continue to be stuck in a space where the pendulum shifts back and forth.
So the one thing I'm now going to throw down for institutions a little bit. And so one of the things that happened in that same time period, we saw the 60s moving into the 70s, was in local communities, you saw deep changes in how power was actually distributed. So we saw, particularly in municipalities, community boards and different types of neighborhood associations and things like that were actually built into the governance process. So when people were able to come together, they were able to make decisions about what was happening within their community, and those decisions were binding on local government. And that was a notion of collective good, the idea that people could come together and do that and have that kind of power. We saw this in major cities across the country, Atlanta, New York, DC. I mean, these structures and infrastructure existed. And they changed over time. In some cases, they're still on the books today in the same form, but the democratic culture of how we understand how to exercise power, how we understand it was lost. There were, frankly, administrative shifts, new rules that came out of mayor's offices and city managers that said, oh, now these commissions have to come through us and this, that, and the other. These were never codified rules. They were just a book that somebody wrote. We can actually write another rule book. Right? There's nothing, all these systems, norms, mores were created by people with a specific vision of a country they wanted to see. There's an ability to shift and change those ideas, to try new things, to get out there and say, we're going to do things a little differently, and we're just going to try it. We're going to think creatively. And as I mentioned earlier this week, there is no roadmap for this. No democracy in the history of the world has ever been truly inclusive on a fully multiracial, multi-ethnic, pluralistic level. It hasn't happened. So to create this, we have some information, right? We know what has worked better and worse in the past. We know how to see and engage for people in communities. We know how to think about how policy engages and connects with this work, but it's not, there's no roadmap, there's no single policy. One thing that we get a lot in philanthropy is like, can't we all just get together and come up with a single plan? And we all just stick to the plan and fund that plan and we're all gonna do the same thing. No, just no, that's not going to happen. One, I don't think it's a particularly good idea. We shouldn't all necessarily be singing from the same songbook, but we should be able to harmonize. There should be some clear understandings about core values that we're striving towards in a shared way so that the experiments, the efforts, the organizing and engagement resonate under the same principles of freedom, liberation, fairness, equity. So, but these do have a need for institutional underpinnings. It's a massive country. Geography, the number of people, the fact is there is no democratic process to make decisions that doesn't have to implicate some system or institution. So these systems and institutions have to be designed with the understanding that we want to say markets don't deliver freedom and they are not the best way to determine how to distribute resources. They have to be designed with the notion that whiteness is not normative and it is not the center of how we consider what's right. They have to be designed excluding patriarchal norms, and we have to do this intentionally. But new systems, new operation, new opportunities for different kinds of institutions will repeat the same challenges if the underlying paradigms are not addressed in their redesign.
So let's do one more question and then we'll open it up to the audience. So I think all of us, you all are doing such interesting work. I think we'd all like to hear a little more concretely certain steps you think all these people out there, a lot of them are thinking about what career I want to have, where I want to go. Where do you think there are openings for people to take on particular challenges that are likely to be particularly successful in light of white grievance, overemphasis on individualism, structures and systems of power, other things that we didn't talk about, the divided media culture, which is feeding people endless propaganda, which is not a lot of grounding in reality. Where concretely should we go? And in particular, we've been talking about the connection between the three different areas. Do you, in terms of the way that you've seen this framed in the mainstream media, would the progressive efforts be better targeted at here are a couple things we can get done now, and then maybe 2 years from now we'll get these things done? Or is that strategy doomed to failure because those particular things, even if they're successful, won't change the overall culture, and then when the pendulum swings back, we'll lose those things and we'll be back where we started.
I'm sorry.
You want to take that one first?
I can start.
You see.
Well, I was just gonna say all of it. All of it, where you should go, anywhere you go is gonna make a difference because you're Northeastern law students, right? So just get out there and do it. And I walk through a room and we find each other, right?
Yeah.
So all of it, just go and make a difference. I believe deeply that we can change our institutions and we change them by being a part of it and being unreasonable once we get there, right? I feel like where I've had the most impact professionally is in government, which is the most restrictive institution that I've worked for. But I knew the rules and I knew how to push the envelope within them, right? And you can achieve big victories. But I would argue that's everywhere. We need to be putting points on the board and trying to win every day. Mm-hmm. And we need to create systems where we can maintain those wins. Those things have to happen at the same time. We can't say we're gonna this person's going to become president and everything's going to be fixed, or we're going to pass this law and everything's going to be fixed. We have to have a vision, and I feel a little differently about like what is the common vision. We have to have a North Star vision of where we want to be. And once we have that
I think
vision,
we agree on common vision. I'm just saying there's going to be a number of paths.
sure, I like the harmonizing.
Yeah.
But once we have that vision, then let's start putting points on the board to get closer to what success might look like. 61% of the population right now says that corporations are the most trustworthy institution in this country. Less than 50% feel that way about government, and even less about media, right? So we have a lot of work to do to demand like that, and people don't trust government because government doesn't necessarily show up. And we haven't created an infrastructure that insists that they do. So to answer your question, I think that we should be everywhere. I think we should fight within whatever institutions we are to change it, because that's how they will change. I think we have a mandate to start to say that government work on behalf of the collective and really figure out how that works. Because once that happens, then politicians who get elected are going to have to work in order to maintain that, right? And you can do that work within government and outside of government. But we're at a real detriment in this country where we think that corporations are the most trustworthy. And it maintains this extractive capitalism that we've been talking about, and the failure, and actually underscores our institutions being allowed to continue not only to fail us, but not represent us. And you just look at the US Supreme Court to put a more finer point on that.
So, thank you. I'm going to spin up a couple of your points. I think from the question is like, do we try for a few things that we can get? It makes me harken back to my law firm settlement days, where you never negotiate against yourself. You never start behind people. Why would we start off in a place where we say, this is what we want, this is what we can get, and this is what we're going to try for? Absolutely not. We state what we want and we go for it relentlessly. Other people will try and make those changes. We do not have to compromise against ourselves. We do not have to try and negotiate what we think someone's going to do next. There are logical ways that implicate, I think, we have to thought about what are these political compromises that have to be made? How do we deal with that? We know there are electoral strategies that must take that into account. And so we allow that to do that. And when we look at the movement folks that are in place, we look at how they're going to drive harder, give no quarter, give no ground. Why? Because no one's acting by themselves. They're all a part of an ecosystem, and seeing that sort of 10,000-foot view means to me, I agree with Catherine, do what you can, where you can, with what moves you. Understand who you are, what is your passion, and frankly, what is your personality? How is it suited to do the work that can sustain you and not drain you? How do you engage in the world? How do you understand who you are? Be true and honor that, and take that clear understanding and move it into a space where you can be most effective for the longest period of time. And there's no problem with shifting. There's no problem with changing. There's no problem with finding something new and learning and building on how we grow. That is how we grow. That is how the movement's going to grow. That's how change is going to occur. So I think we have a lot of notions out there that we do need to change, lots of ideas that do need to happen, but I agree fundamentally. We need the work that you want to do to get done. We have every confidence by the fact that you're here, that is going to be the right work.
I want to pick up on Catherine's point, like, it doesn't matter where you end up. Just do the good work where you are. There was a point where I became a little disillusioned with the practice of law, and I was telling people like, yeah, you don't really need to go to law law school. It's don't incur the debt. And the reality is the thing that made you want to go to law school to begin with is probably something that doesn't necessarily require a law degree. And I've since changed from that perspective.
I was gonna say, you said the law part quiet.
But now just, kind of watching the evolution of the Supreme Court, I was just like, we need to pack this thing with as many progressive, thoughtful attorneys so that they're in the pipeline. So you all need to be in the pipeline, increasing the numbers. Whether or not you ultimately become considered for an appointment to the Supreme Court or to the federal bench or to the state bench, or if you work alongside somebody who ultimately gets appointed because of the way that you show up in space and the advocacy that you do, the way that you conduct yourself, the issues that you advocate for, the ways in which you are unreasonable about the things that matter. I think that's truly important. I think it's also important to be connected to community. We can't be going into places doing work saying that we're speaking on behalf of folks when we're not even talking to the folks that we're saying we're advocating on behalf of.
Absolutely.
The movement needs to inform the perspective that we have about the work and the way that we move in the work. My advocacy when I was at the ACLU directing the racial justice program, there was significant tension because we were this well-funded, large nonprofit that, and I'll say a white nonprofit, even though there were people of color within the organization, the leadership structure and the history of the organization were that of a white organization. And there were these grassroots abolitionist community organizations that were doing work on police reform, and they would consistently throw shade at us. And folks were like, why are they doing this? Why? And the reality is because of the organization's history, these legacy organizations would show up and suck all the air out of them. So there's an issue being debated on Beacon Hill. Well, the ACLU comes and says, yes, this is the position that we should take, that the lawmakers should take, and it's the progressive position, and it's the reformist position. Meanwhile, abolitionists, who are the ones living in the communities that are dealing with whatever the issue is, are saying, no, that's not the solution we want. But because the ACLU or any other organization shows up and says this would be a reasonable solution, lawmakers were like, well, that's what the ACLU said, or that's what Common Cause said, or that's what the League of Women Voters said, right? And so being mindful of how, I saw the chuckle, being mindful of how we take up space and how we create space for other advocacy organizations to push forward on issues, and sometimes falling back. And it takes people in these organizations who eventually get to positions of leadership, of management, to say, look, we need to fall back, because there's people on the ground who are doing the work. And as long as we are occupying all the space in this area, these organizations are going to be stifled in their ability to continue to build power to affect change. And so that notion of allyship really takes on a different meaning. So I think that's something that is important. I think there are particular areas of law that folks should consider. I mean, I think labor is hugely important. I think public health is hugely important. The criminal legal system is always going to be an issue. Always need good people. And then this newer space, and I don't know who's teaching on this, but like the metaverse and the privatization of public responsibilities and services is huge, right? How much of the public good and the things that we look to government to do become privatized and offloaded and become corporate issues, and then corporate virtual issues where it's avatars doing. So I don't know enough about it. I'm sure there's very learned people who have a lot of experience with this, but to the extent that anybody's exploring that, dive in and bring these progressive, right-minded Northeastern values to that work.
To the metaverse. Actually, there is one thing I would add. As we think about evolving technology, one of the things that I think, and I'm prepared to be disagreed with, I'm interested to see if I am, is really these questions about data collection, how data is organized and leveraged, particularly through algorithms. All these questions about data, how data is collected, whether or not we're going to look at how it's organized, arranged, aggregated, and what it means and comes out the other side is absolutely essential to both the functioning of the country as well as being the next threshold for the civil rights. That there are not enough civil rights attorneys that are well versed in these issues of technology, given the numbers of people that are going to be impacted and are currently impacted by decisions and choices that are made by machine learning and technology.
Absolutely.
And so that is one thing I will say, yes, that's a gap.
We have a graduate who's a national leader in this field. We tried to lure her to our faculty, but President Biden stole her away. It was Rashida Richardson.
Yep.
So, so that was all very inspiring. I might add that one way you could all get involved, Rashawn is running for district attorney in Plymouth County.
That's a matter of public information.
So that.
That's good.
You're saying it's another public information?
Yes, that's public information. Yes. Not an endorsement, but.
So we'd love to hear questions or comments.